Between 1993 and 2010, New York police found the bodies of 8 missing women. Their remains scattered across Long Island. It took 30 years to identify them all and 30 years to find the monster responsible for killing them. Hey guys, if you watched episode 1 of this case, you'll know that we talked about the Gilgo Beach serial killer and his crimes. But in this episode, we're going to be going into how he was finally caught. But before we get into it, as a disclaimer, there is mentions of torture and CSA material, so just be cautious of that. But a little recap of some of the details we mentioned in episode 1. So, between 2010 and 2011, the remains of 11 people were found buried along Ocean Parkway in Long Island. We have the first 4 who were found in 2010, known as the Gilgo 4, and they were all killed by the same person. Then, we also have the remains of 3 other people who were found: a mother, a toddler, and a trans woman. At the time, none of these people were connected to the case. And then there was more. There's 3 more victims whose dismembered remains were also found. They were scattered all around Long Island. We have Jessica Taylor, who was identified in 2011. We talked a bit more about her in episode 1. And today we're going to be talking a little bit more about the 2 other remaining unidentified women. So, there's a serial killer on Long Island, and we know he has a profile. He targets young, petite women who are sex workers, and he disfigures and dismembers their remains intentionally to make identifying them even harder. And this killer, he's smart. He knows what he's doing, and he's been doing this for a while. But despite the number of victims and community fears, the investigation stalled from 2011 until 2020, which is where we're going to start today's episode. So, we have a serial killer on Long Island who has been killing women for decades, going completely undetected. Now, so far, what we know about this serial killer before the investigation ended up, going cold in 2011, we know that he would wrap and bound his victims in camouflage burlap. He would dismember them sometimes, and this was very intentional to make identifying these people harder. And he was targeting young, petite women who were mostly sex workers and dumping their bodies all along like the same general area. And not only that, we know that he liked to terrorize his victims over the phone, which goes to show that this is someone who craves more from the killings. This is someone who thinks, oh, I can get away with just taunting people. And he thinks that he is that smart. And maybe in some ways, he is smart because he has been undetected for so long. But that is going to change. As far as we know, the investigation ended up stalling in 2011, and nothing really came from it until around 2020. And in the first episode, I talked about as to why this was. There was just a lot of political conflict behind the scenes when it came to law enforcement. They were just pretty much very incapable. And there were a lot of people at the very top of command that were contributing to this investigation not being able to progress. And one of these people was James Burke, which I had talked about. And not only that, there was just a lot of negative stigma towards sex workers and people not feeling this desire to want to find these women. But after years of this case pretty much going nowhere, 12 years, finally, in 2022, the Suffolk County was able to get a new police commissioner, and his name is Rodney Harrison. And he comes in, right? He's like a fresh pair of eyes onto this case. He is taking over, taking charge, and he's wondering, how have we not found this guy yet? What is going on, right? And obviously he comes into it kind of knowing about the case. How could he not? It's so popular. Everyone knows about this case. But now he has a chance to actually do something about it. So he decides, okay, we're putting together a new task force and we're going to have everybody on board. We're going to have the Suffolk County Police, the state police, the FBI, because he truly believed that the only way this investigation could move forward is if everyone was working together in a collaborative effort. unlike what James Burke thought. And he really thought, we're going to get to the bottom of these crimes. So now, after so long, we have a really refreshing and new approach to this case and a different way that this department is going to handle it. And one of the first things that they decided to do was to digitalize all of the evidence so it could be easier to go through and to make it searchable. Because what we have, right, is 12 years of evidence. And it's a lot. A lot of this hasn't been looked at properly in a while. So digitalizing it just makes things a lot easier. And as they were going through it, there was one piece of evidence that really stood out to them that kind of helped them, figure out where is our starting point, right? Because we have all of this information. Where do we start? And that was a police report from Amber Costello's roommate, Dave Schaller. Now, at the time, like way back when, Dave gave the police a really detailed description of a man who came by the house on one of the evenings soon before Amber disappeared. And not only did he provide the police a description of what this guy looked like, he also told the police about his car. And this is such a significant piece of evidence that the police decided, okay, this is a great place for us to start our new investigation. Now, one of the main reasons this makes it a great starting point is because Amber Costello, she went missing 3 months before they found the bodies of the Gilgo Four. So that was kind of the freshest lead that they had. Now, if you need like a quick reminder as to who Amber Costello was, she went missing back in 2010, and her roommate Dave had an arrangement where they would oftentimes have clients come over to the house and Dave would chase them out and like pretend to be his boyfriend. That was kind of Dave's role in all of this. Nonetheless, though, when they decided to go back and see, okay, we have this police report, we need to find out more though, right? So Dave seems to be a reliable source. Perhaps let's go over to his house and find out more. Like, where was Amber going that night? Like, who was the last person to see her? What was she doing? Basically, they just needed a recap. They needed to know more, right? Because this is like a new task force that's now involved in this investigation. These are not the same people from back in 2010. So they decide to go over to Amber Costello's house where her roommate, Dave Schaller, and another roommate named Bear was still living at. They were still living there together. And they talk to Dave. And Dave then tells the police pretty much the same thing he told police like 10 years prior. But now a lot of things were just making more sense. And now for Dave as well, someone who had this image of this man in his head for years, knowing that he had this really strong feeling that this was the man who took Amber, now he can finally do something with this information. So this is what he told investigators. There was a client who came over to the house, and this was someone who had found Amber from Craigslist. Because as we know, Amber, does outreach on Craigslist for her work and how she finds her clients. And this was one of the first altercations between Amber and this client, this man, this unnamed man so far. Now, Amber strictly told this guy, like, I'm only dancing, I don't do sex. Okay, so she made it very clear from the start, you can come over and I'll provide your services, but don't expect more out of it. Now, on that night, the client was going over, Dave, the roommate, was out for the night. He was doing his own thing, but he wasn't gone for long. He was probably out of the house for like maximum 30 minutes. But during this time while he was out, Amber called Dave, like freaking out. She was on the phone with him, like, I'm in the bathroom. I'm hiding from him. Like, I told this guy I'm only going to be dancing for him, but he was grabbing on me and it really did not seem like he was going to take no for an answer. So of course, when Dave was on the phone hearing all of this, he was like, oh, hell no. So he rushed back home, worried about Amber, and busted through the bathroom to find her sitting like on the toilet seat, like terrified for her life. And Amber just looks at Dave like, is he still here? She didn't even know if the client was still in their house or not, which goes to show that she just scurried off into the bathroom and locked herself in there, waiting for Dave to just come back and save her. And as Dave was kind of standing in the doorway between the bathroom, this really strong, loud voice came from behind him. And all he said was, "Who the fuck are you?" And Dave turns around and he sees this huge, like 6'5" guy just standing there. Dave doesn't know this man. Actually, Dave is the one who lives here. So actually, who is this guy? And Dave was stunned, right? Because this guy is huge. He was like the size of the door. That's how Dave described him. And he was pissed. He wanted his money back. He had felt like he gotten scammed because he came here thinking he was going to get sex. And when Amber said no, this made him unhappy. He didn't like being told no. So the Dave told this guy, right? Get out of the house. Like, I don't care about anything anymore. Get out, because clearly he's made Amber uncomfortable. Clearly he's crossed a line. Now, they had another roommate that I mentioned earlier. His name is Bear. I don't know if that's a nickname or if that's actually his name, but they had a pit bull dog. And this guy was kind of like not really wanting to leave the house. So Bear threatened to unleash the dog onto him and was like, if you don't get out, I'm going to put this pit bull onto you. And it seemed like this threat actually got the man like kind of moving, like finally. So now Bear and Dave are like trying to push this huge guy out of the house. And as they were doing this, right? Because imagine this guy is so big that he's towering over both of these men. So as you're trying to shove him out, this man doesn't even look at the two guys putting hands on him. He looks straight past them, right at Amber. His eyes is locked in on her, completely focused on her. From the moment he's pushed out of the house, he never takes his eyes off of Amber. Now, soon after Amber went missing, there was this initial police report. Dave told the police all of this. He gave a description of the man. He told the police how this guy was a huge guy, beady ass eyes, his hair color, his face shape. He described him as an ogre. So at the time, Dave was like, hey, I gave you this great description. Why has nothing come from this? So of course, now that Dave is retelling the events of what happened, we're all probably thinking, Dave, the police, us, like, why did the police not do anything about this way back then during the first investigation when they had this detailed account of what this guy looked like? And even then, right, he gave the police more information. He didn't just tell them what this guy looked like, but he also told them what car he drove. Even their other roommate, Bear, saw the car that he drove. So they have like two testimonies from two different people describing basically this dark green Chevy Avalanche, which is this really big truck. It's a pretty unique color, pretty unique design. And, they're kind of thinking, how many people in Long Island are like a 6'5" giant guy driving around in a dark green Chevy Avalanche? There's probably not that many of them if the police had actually looked into this like back in 2010. So now this task force, they have this information from Dave. They were able to find out more about what happened that night. They were able to confirm, his testimony of what this guy looked like, what car he drove. So from the very first meeting of this new task force being put together in February 1st of 2020, in just 6 weeks, by March 14th, they were able to do what no one was able to do in 12 years. They found a suspect, and his name was Rex Heuermann. Now, let's talk about how the task force actually managed to catch this guy, because the way they put all of this digital evidence together is actually pretty amazing. So what we have up until this point is them being able to have like a suspect in mind because of this detailed description of the car he drove and what he looks like. Again, there's not that many people who fit that description who live in Long Island. So now they have a suspect. So the next thing was to look at phones. Specifically burner phones, because they know back from the 2010 investigation that this guy liked to use prepaid burner phones to contact a lot of his victims. He did this with the Gilgo 4, he did this with the victims' family members. We've talked a little bit about this in episode 1. So with this new task force, they decided to, kind of go back in time and map out where these phones were physically located every single time they were used to call one of the victims prior to their death. And as they did this, a very clear pattern started to emerge. They could see very clearly that the burner phones pinged between cell towers in 2 locations, in Massapequa Park and Midtown Manhattan. Nowhere else. Just those 2 places over and over again consistently. So this shows them, okay, This must mean that like the killer lives in one of these places and perhaps works in the other. That's like the only explanation that makes sense, you know? Obviously, he must live in one of those places if it's like continuously, pinging him there. And this actually aligns with Rex's profile because he was a resident of Long Island and they were able to find out that he worked in Midtown Manhattan as an architect. He owned his own firm. So now they were able to basically cross reference the burner phone activity with the victim's own phones, right? Maybe it sounds a little bit technical, but all in all, they're basically just using the phones like to track him. So in July 10th of 2009, this was the last day Melissa Barthelemy was seen alive. And they could see that a burner phone was used to contact her. And when they looked at it, this burner phone and Heuermann's, I'm going to refer to him as Heuermann instead of Rex throughout this case. So they could see the burner phone used to contact Melissa and Heuermann's personal phone were always moving together consistently. They would be together in the same area in Massapequa Park, and then they would travel together over to New York City. And then afterwards, they would travel back. So this kind of shows them that, one person consistently had both of the phones on them, which was Rex Heuermann. Now, there was also the calls that were made to Melissa's little sister, Amanda, the calls that Heuermann made when she was just 15 years old, basically just taunting her, which is just psychotic. And when this happened at the time, they were actually able to trace back these calls to Midtown Manhattan. So back then, they knew kind of where the location of these calls were being made, but they didn't really know what this meant. Like there was no context around that information. But now they know that the calls were made really close to where Heuermann worked. It was right by his office, his architect firm. So this meant he was making these calls while he was commuting to and from work. But the digital trail didn't just stop at the phone calls that he was making to these victims. They also were able to pull up his Google account that was linked to these burner phones. I'm going to be honest with you guys, I don't really know the technical things of like how burner phones work. I don't even think I've ever used one before. I didn't even know a Google account could be linked to one. So if that is confusing to you, just know that you're not alone. But all that we need to know is that there's a Google account linked to a phone, and what they found was so disturbing. They were basically able to uncover more of his, activity online. And they were able to see that he had thousands of searches related to finding sex workers and viewing really messed up like torture pornography as well as CSA material. It was just a lot of stuff that was like very, very illegal. And this specific account was also linked to over like 200 online searches specifically naming the victims, which means that he was continuously looking up updates on the, Long Island serial killer investigation. He was Googling his own case, basically. For years, he was just looking at it over and over again, looking up the victims' names, looking at their photos, trying to find information about the victims' families. All of this kind of reminds me of this one scene from Mindhunter, which I think is one of the best true crime TV shows out there, where in this episode, they talked about how serial killers like to revisit the site of the murder, where they committed the crime, because this gives the killer the same kind of rush when they first killed their victim. And it's only a smaller feeling of that moment, but it allows them to relive it. And this was exactly what Heuermann was doing. He was making these repeated phone calls to people who knew the victims, taunting them, making them fearful of him, because this is what he did to his victims. And now he was able to kind of relive that same sense of like rush. And, why else, right, would he risk giving police that evidence, risk giving police the chance to trace his phone calls to find out who he was, unless this feeling he had was really just that strong and uncontrollable, like this huge urge that he couldn't deny. He just had to do this. Now, we know a little bit about who Rex Heuermann is based on his crimes and what he did to his victims, but who was he really? Before we get into how they were able to catch him, we're going to spend a moment talking about who he actually was. Because on paper, and who he was in person, it almost seems like two different people. Who this guy was in the investigation versus those who knew him in his personal life, it's just such a contrast. Now, Rex Heuermann, he was born and raised in Massapequa Park, Long Island. So he's lived there his whole life. He went to a local high school there. And then afterwards, he built a career in architecture. So he was, making good money for himself. He worked in Manhattan and would just pretty much commute back and forth to and from Long Island. And he also owned his own firm, RH Consultants, and he's been working in Manhattan since 1987. So nearly 40 years in the same city. And he also lived in the same house that he grew up in, which is going to be very significant. And I'll get into a little bit more about that in a little bit. But he was also married with two children, his wife, Asa Elup, and he had two, adult children at the time of this case. And otherwise, he seemed like a relatively, normal guy, wife, two kids, steady job. Like there was just really nothing that significant about him. Although he didn't really talk to his neighbors much, he wasn't really that involved with the community. But, some people thought he was a little creepy because he was like kind of introverted, and also like he is this huge guy. Guys, like he's massive. Like not only is he tall, but he's also like a bit heavy set. So he's just like a really big guy overall. And like this kind of creeped people out, not just because of the fact that he was quiet and because of his size, but because of his house as well. There was just something about his house, the same house he used to live in when he was a child, that has been standing there for around 60 years. Something about it really rubbed people the wrong way because his home looked run down. It wasn't really, clean. It wasn't renovated. It was messy. I mean, it was literally the same house from his childhood. It was almost like a time capsule from his childhood. And this really made people feel uncomfortable because in this whole neighborhood, a lot of the homes are quite polished, quite clean. So his home specifically stuck out like a sore thumb. People knew he was an architect, so it was a little bit weird how his job and kind of status didn't reflect how his house looked. Even during Halloween, when kids would go trick-or-treating, they would specifically avoid his house. So obviously there were some things about Heuermann that was like off to people. He was a little bit creepy, never really interacted with his neighbors. His house is just weird. But obviously this is not enough for anybody to like call the police over it, because beyond that, he was still pretty much a relatively normal guy to people who knew him personally. So now that we kind of know who Heuermann was a little bit, let's go back to the investigation. Because at this point, they've started accumulating all of this digital evidence against him, right? The burner phones and like tracing that back to these set locations. But they still needed more. They needed something more concrete, like DNA. They needed his DNA that they could connect back to the crimes all the way from 2010. Because when some of the bodies were first found, there was hair on them, but they didn't have any suspect to link it to. Now that they have Heuermann in their sights, they need to find a way to get some of his DNA so they can confirm this match. So one of the hairs that were found on one of the victims in the burlap that they were bounded in, at the time of discovery, it was a little bit too degraded, because the body had pretty much been there for a while. So obviously that means, DNA over time is gonna disintegrate. It's gonna be hard for them to kind of make a link. And also back then in like 2010, 2011, obviously DNA technology wasn't as good as it is in 2022, years later when they pick up the investigation. But now that, DNA testing is better, they were able to use mitochondrial DNA testing. And I'm not gonna get into what that really is. It's way too technical. It's basically just a more advanced and effective type of DNA testing. So they were able to get that hair that they found on the burlap. And when they tested it in 2022, they were able to see that this hair was actually female. It belonged to a woman. Now, this was a little bit strange because who could this belong to? Obviously, it's not Rex Heuermann because he's a man. So investigators at some point, when they had Heuermann as a suspect, they were kind of scoping around outside his house, and they were able to pick up some trash, like leftover bottles. And when they tested it for DNA, there was a clear link between Asa, Heuermann's wife, and that female hair strand that they found on the burlap back in like 2011. So now the question was, Did his wife know about what was happening? Was she involved in the crimes? Was this maybe something bigger than just one man acting alone? This is what the investigators concluded. The most likely explanation for this was transfer. What does this mean? Well, it means that Heuermann was at home preparing and handling the burlap that he was going to use to wrap his victims with. And obviously, he lives with his wife. He interacts with his wife on a daily basis. And also, her hair would be all over things in their home, like on the surfaces, on the furniture. So this was just an instance of like hair being transferred over onto the burlap, just by like, you could say like a crazy coincidence. Now, obviously, this is a really significant piece of evidence because this again ties Heuermann to the crimes. Maybe not directly because it's his wife's hair, but this was still enough to show them that they were on the right track. But at the time that they had found this evidence, a lot of people were thinking that his wife was in on it, that she was somehow involved. Because, it almost seems a little bit crazy to just like by chance have your hair on the victim's remains. But they were able to conclude that she did not have anything to do with any of this. But nonetheless, they still needed Heuermann's DNA. Like they had his wife's, but they needed his. And the way they did this was with pizza. So up until this point of the investigation, police had pretty much been tracking Rex Heuermann for 10 months. From the point the task force was formed, and then 6 weeks later, when they had, a suspect, when they named him, up until then, for 10 months, they started tracking him. Because they knew he was the serial killer. They just needed to prove it. They needed enough evidence to make an arrest. So at this point, they had been trailing him for a really long time. They know his routines, what he does, what he eats on a daily basis. And they were able to see that he liked to eat pizza on the go while he was working, like a lot. And keep in mind throughout all of this, like as they were surveillancing him, this was all done like very low key. This wasn't like publicized to the media where everyone knew there was like this new investigation and, they were trailing him. Obviously not, because this would tip him off. So they were working in secret, like really on the down low. So he obviously had no clue he was being followed and he was being watched. He was just doing his normal routine, eating pizza on the go. And they were just waiting for their moment that Heuermann would leave some DNA behind somewhere. Then, on January 26th of 2023, after 10 months of just following this crazy guy around, they watch him, munch on his pizza and throw the box into a trash can on the sidewalk in busy, like Midtown Manhattan. And they went over to it, they recovered this box, and they found that there was a pizza crust left over. So they sent it over to the crime lab, and they were able to match the DNA from the pizza crust to a male hair that was found in the burlap used to restrain Megan Waterman. So finally, after decades of no answers, years of victims' families, advocating for more from the investigation, there was a 12-year-old case that was finally now revived, where they were able to go through all of this evidence and just watch Rex for months of planning. And it was just all finally done. Like they got him. All because of a pizza crust that he threw into a bin on a random Tuesday afternoon. So on the evening of July 13th, 2023, a group of officers, they were wearing plain clothes. They looked like normal civilians. They were following Rex as he was just walking down the street, minding his own business, as he does every other day. And they suddenly come all around, they surround him, and they arrest him right outside his Midtown office in a really, public, busy street. And he was completely blindsided by this. Like he had no idea he was being followed. He had no idea they were on his trail. But when he was arrested, he wasn't like shocked. He wasn't like, oh my God. Like, yes, he was blindsided, but he was very calm, actually. Which to me, like that only makes him creepier. Like he wasn't even shocked at the fact that he was arrested. He was almost like compliant with the arrest. And, arresting him in public wasn't just this kind of like way to get at him and, humiliate him in one way, but it was also a safety concern. Because investigators knew that he had a lot of guns. They knew that he was a hunter, that he was a marksman. He had a passion for collecting and owning guns. And he had up until around 300 guns in his possession. I'm talking pistols, semi-automatic rifles, revolvers, literally Any gun you could think of, he probably owned, and it was all locked behind a metal door in his basement. And he had probably permits for around 92 of them, and the rest were unregistered. But all in all, he had a lot of guns. So if they were to arrest Huerman at his home, this could be a really huge safety risk to everyone involved. So arresting him in public was just safer for everybody. So now Rex Huerman was arrested, and he was initially charged with the murder of 3 of the 4 Gilgo women: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. Now, these charges do later expand as the case was, able to continue building against him. But when they first made this arrest, the public reaction was, not only immediate, but almost like this shared disbelief. Like, for a lot of people who knew him, they couldn't believe that Rex Huerman was the Long Island serial killer who had been out murdering women for decades. Because to them, those who knew him, he was just like a normal guy. He was just some architect who worked in Manhattan, who had a family. Like, there was no reason for them to believe that he could be involved in anything. So after Rex Huerman's arrest, investigators had to search his entire house. Obviously, they need more evidence. He's arrested now. They have a warrant for it. But the search on his house took 12 days. Like, they were very aggressive with it. They didn't waste any time. They searched everywhere. They ripped everything apart, and they were able to uncover a huge amount of evidence. And what they found inside, it confirmed that this was not a man who just randomly snapped and was like killing all of these women. No, this was a man who was meticulously planning, preparing, and documenting his crimes for decades. So as I had mentioned earlier, in his basement, he had a vault that held all of his guns, exactly 279 guns. He had hundreds of electronic devices that, had a lot of really sadistic, messed up torture and really weird pornography. He also had like a life-size doll in a glass case. He had a portrait of a woman who was like covered in bruises. Just like some really, really nasty stuff. And they also recovered this document that was recovered from a hard drive where he tried to delete the file, but they were able to, get it back. And this document was created in the year 2000. Okay. So he's been using it for who knows how long. It's a really old document. And when they looked into it, this document, it contained like a checklist for items he needed to commit murder, how to dispose of the bodies, where to dump the bodies, how to avoid leaving DNA behind. And he even had reminders for himself to limit noise, how to clean the bodies, how to destroy evidence. This whole document was basically a plan on how to commit crimes and get away with it. He even had tips for himself on how to do a better job for next time. He wrote things like, try to hit the victim harder, try to get some rest so you have more time to torture your victims. So, from all of this, it was very clear as well that he tortured these women before he killed them as well. And each time he did this to them, he wanted to learn from it, to adapt from it so he can do better for the next time. Like, oh my God, like this guy is sadistic, clearly. Now, after the search, the home was pretty much destroyed. Like, they ripped things apart, they took things apart. But Rex Huerman's family, his wife and 2 kids, that's where they lived as well. So when they returned to the home, they were now living in a house, that not only belonged to a serial killer, that they had lived in this house with a serial killer, but now everything was torn apart. And for Asa, his wife of 25 years, she did file for a divorce right after his arrest. Like, she didn't want to have anything to do with him. But it was also really hard for her to come to terms with what happened. I mean, she even said, like, nobody wants to think that they've been living with and sleeping next to a serial killer for the past 25 years. Now, I'm going to take a moment to talk about Huerman's family for a little bit, because in a lot of ways, they were also victims of Rex Huerman as well. They were also affected by his crimes. And when they returned home, like, not only was the house a mess, like, the bathtub was cut open, floors ripped up, couches and mattresses removed, like their beds were gone. Victoria, their daughter, she worked at her dad's architecture firm, and now she was unemployed. And her stepbrother, Christopher, he had special needs and, he was struggling to comprehend what was going on at all. He really couldn't understand the gravity of the situation. And, to make matters worse, Asa was also struggling with skin and breast cancer. So her medical insurance was tied to Heuermann's employment. So now they lost everything. They lost their dad, her husband. They lost someone who was financially providing for them, who was giving them work. And not only that, they also lost their privacy because now, they were obviously made a spectacle. Long Island serial killer's family lives here in this weird, creepy old house. Let's go up to them and film them and take pictures of them, which, by the way, was what was happening. There was groups of people just loitering around the house while the family was just outside chilling. I can't imagine being put through something like that. Their life was also flipped upside down. And, the press wanted to, get the perspective of the family. They wanted to talk to them and question them about how this was affecting them. But I don't think you need to question them to know how hard it was for them to deal with all of this. So, even though back then it was a little controversial in some ways, people were like, yeah, but the victim's family were also going through so much and they deserve sympathies. And of course, I agree as well, they do. But so does Heuermann's family. They weren't involved with any of these crimes. They were also victims of his. So now, Heuermann was arrested in July of 2023, right? And as I had mentioned, he was charged with 3 murders. But even though that was the case, investigators made it clear that they weren't done. They weren't just going to charge him with 3 murders and be done with it and be like, whoop, we did it. No. Over the next 2.5 years, they were bringing more and more charges to Rex Heuermann. And the full picture of what he had done was now starting to come into clear focus. Everyone was able to see that these were killing sprees that had gone undetected for over 3 days. And they stretched further and further and further back. In January of 2024, so around 6 months after his arrest, he was now formally charged with the murder of Maureen Bonds. She was the last of the Gilgo 4, and on that day that he was charged with this murder, Maureen's daughter stood in that courtroom, and she was just 25 years old, the same age her mother was when she was killed. Then, in June of 2024 as well, he was now charged with the murder of Jessica Taylor, who was killed in 2003. And she was also one of the 3 women whose dismembered remains were found all along Long Island. I talked about her in episode 1. So now at this point, there's 5 charges against him. Then, actually, at the same time, he was also charged with Sandra Costilla, who was killed in 1993. She was a cold case for pretty much nearly 30 years. They were not able to identify who she was or who had killed her. In 1993, her body had been found in the woods by hunters, and this was only around 60 miles from Gilgo Beach. She was previously never connected to Rex Heuermann, at all, but only until the second investigation took place where they had better DNA technology, they were able to make a match to the hairs found near her remains to Heuermann's DNA as well, which is why they were now able to make this charge. But with this new charge also brought insight to the fact that this timeline didn't just go back to the 2010s or the early 2000s. This was even pre-2000s. 1993. At this point, Rex Heuermann was around 29 years old when he killed Sandra Costilla, one of the first supposed murders of this entire case. That was also the same year he started, his architecture firm. So this just goes to show that this killing happened way before people even knew what Gilgo Beach was, and way before the first set of bodies were found in 2010. But they didn't stop there with the charges, because in December of 2024, they had the final charge before his guilty plea. And this was for Valerie Mack, who was killed in 2000. She was also one of the dismembered remains that they had found back in 2011. I had briefly mentioned this in episode 1 as well, but I didn't really dive into her case as much. And then here, maybe I can add a little information as to who Valerie Mack was. Her torso at the time was found by a hunter's dog in a plastic bag, and it was wrapped up in duct tape, and she had clearly been decapitated. Both of her hands were gone. Her right leg was gone. There was just no way to identify her way back then when she was first found. They just had her torso. She was all cut up. So at the time, she was only known as Jane Doe number 6 for almost 20 years until finally there was some justice and closure for her as well. So now the timeline of this case, it goes all the way back to 1993, and then 2010 when the first set of the Gilgo 4 was found, and then 2023 when they finally made his arrest. 17 years of killing, 8 confirmed victims, and a man who spent nearly 3 decades going to work, coming home, raising a family, and just killing vulnerable women between all of it. Now, on April 8th, 2026, so exactly 1,000 days after his arrest, Rex Heuermann walks into the Suffolk County courtroom, and it's packed with, media and the victims' families, uniformed officials. Like, it was a full courtroom. And this was a really intense, emotional day for a lot of people, and especially for the victims' families. A lot of them were just crying. They started sobbing as soon as he began to speak, because finally, after all of these years, they're confronted with the man who killed their loved ones. But even then, throughout all of this, right, he never once showed any sign of emotional distress. Never. His face was always flat. Like, there was just no emotion behind his eyes. And the district attorney, he walks the entire courtroom through each victim, one by one. How Heuermann contacted them, what he had done to them, where he dumped their bodies. And when, Heuermann was asked his method of killing his victims, he only said one word in response: strangulation. And even then, he confirmed what he did to his victims, that he bounded their heads and legs and wrapped their bodies in burlap and then just discarded them like they were worth nothing to him. And he admitted to a lot of things. Surprisingly, he was actually quite honest about his crimes and what he had done when he was asked. He admitted to using burner phones to contact the woman. He admitted to offering them money to kind of lure them out and as a way to meet them. And he confirmed that he dismembered some of his victims too. And a lot of these things people knew, but they just needed to hear him say it. They needed to hear him admit to it. He then pleaded guilty to 7 murders, right? Just 7 though. But then, in a moment nobody had anticipated, just kind of out of nowhere, he admitted to an 8th, Karen Vergata, who disappeared back in 1996. It was a murder he wasn't even formally charged with, by the way. And when the judge asked him, are you pleading guilty voluntarily of your own free will? He just responds with yes. Now, Heuermann's attorney had said that his decision to plead guilty to this was partly to spare the victim's family, but also his own family. He didn't want to put everyone through a trial, basically. And his attorney said that this was kind of like a cathartic moment for Heuermann, carrying the secret of what he had done for 30 years. For him, it felt like a release. He finally get to let out a breath that he admitted this in a courtroom publicly in front of everyone what he had done. So let's be clear. This wasn't him having some sort of human moment. This wasn't him showing sympathy I don't want to put the victims' families through more torture that I've already put everyone through. No, it was for himself. He wanted to feel this catharsis, this relief. I mean, he's an actual monster, right? He admitted to the murder of Karen Vergata, which I feel like is the least that he can do. It's the bare minimum. She was a woman who was only 34 years old when she disappeared, who was killed and dismembered by him, like many others as well, just remains dumped away like trash. So yeah, this was the least that he could do. Now, his sentencing is scheduled for June 17th of this year. Throughout this whole case, where does this leave us? At the moment, Rex Heuermann is awaiting his sentencing. He is expected to receive 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, followed by 4 additional sentences of 25 years to life. Basically, he's going to die in prison, and that is exactly what he deserves. It's only unfortunate that he wasn't caught sooner to live the rest of his, pathetic life in prison. And for the families of the 8 confirmed victims on April 8th of 2026, that was the day they had spent years waiting for. Finally, after how many years of not having any answers, having no closure, and it's almost bittersweet because now that they had, some closure to like what happened, they had also spent a lot of that time getting to know each other. And I'm talking specifically the victims' family members. A lot of them, got closer throughout all of these years because they could understand what the other person was going through. Their position was really, really unique. It was not something that a lot of people could relate to or empathize with. Even Maureen's sister, Melissa, she said that his guilty plea finally brought solace after living 19 years in this weird space between like heartbreak and hope, just like this weird back and forth, like middle ground, like this gray area where they never really knew, oh, was finally something going to happen from this investigation? Oh, never mind. Oh, maybe, never mind. And then finally, it did. But at the same time, this was also like devastating in a lot of ways because this was really emotional for everyone, as you can imagine. Just like everything happening in this one room, this one man who had stolen so much from all of these different people. And I think for them, it was really hard for them to feel this sense of relief like straight away. You're seeing him get arrested, you're seeing him go to prison, and yes, you're getting this closure, but you've just spent years being in this gray area. You almost don't know what to feel or how to process your feelings. And, in some ways, this case isn't entirely over. As a part of his guilty plea, Rex Heuermann is actually now cooperating with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to try and complete this full picture because they're trying to figure out if he is possibly linked to another set of remains that were found elsewhere in the United States. And not only that, we have the remains that they had found of a possible trans woman back in 2011, and they named this person the Asian Doe, right? Because even up until now, they had not been able to identify who this person was. All they knew was that this person is around 17 to 23 years old at the time that they had been murdered, but there was no actual set connection to Heuermann. This was just some human being who, whose family had no idea where they were or what happened to them. So in a lot of ways, like, yes, this case is closed, but it's not. Because there's also Shannan Gilbert, the woman whose 911 call started all of this. And even though the official ruling was that her death has no connection to Heuermann and that it was just an unfortunate accident, a drowning, her family does not accept this ruling. There's still a lot of things that are unanswered throughout all of this. Because on her 911 call, she said that someone was trying to kill her. And whether it was Heuermann who was after her and, he simply just hasn't been charged for it yet, or if it really was an accidental drowning, is maybe something we will never get a definite answer for. What did you guys think about this case? This was such a huge case with just so much detail. So many people were involved and impacted throughout all of this. And researching this and deep diving into it, I really just got to be in the center of it as well and kind of like be involved in the way where like I felt for all of the people involved. And I was also frustrated for them as well, seeing just how incapable some of the police were in the early years of the investigation. But now I also share the sense of relief that now Rex Heuermann has been arrested and captured. But what did you guys think about this case? If you guys have any thoughts you want to share with me down below, please do so. Otherwise, leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.